Dobroveče svima, dobrodošli. Večeras imamo čast da ugostimo velikog engleskog slikara, grafičara, radi crteže, filmove, Derek Bošir. Rođen 37. godine i živi radi u Los Angelesu. Ja ću pričati samo kratko o njegovom radu, a kasnije će to Violeta da malo detaljnije da vam predstavi. A ja imam, da vam kažem, 2-3 stvari i da se zahvalim Prvo, Alanu Materasu koji je isto među nama. On je parijski galerista koji zastupa Derek Bošira. Da se zahvalim, nije večeras među nama, Mila Askarova koja je njegova galerijskinja u Londonu. Zahvaljujući njima imamo čast da ugostimo Dereka ovde, da organizujemo njegovu, mogu da kažem, retrospektivnu izložbu. Zašto? U četvrtak ćemo postaviti izložbu u muzeju grada gde ćemo imati 35 radova. Radovi su iz perioda od 55. do 2019. godine. Šta je meni najznačajnije ovde i ponosan sam, Derek je bio prošle godine ovde i on je prezadovoljan dočekom, gradom, ljudima i tako dalje. I čak je uradio jednu sliku, omaž Savi Šumanoviću, i prošle godine, kad se vratio iz Novog Sada, uradio seriju crteža Fantomi Srbije. Uradio je 10 crteža sa značajnim likovima iz istorije Srbije. Derek je prošle godine odbio Pariz, treba da ima izložbu u Parizu, i odbio Šangaj, treba da ide na izložbu, a vratio se ovde među nas. I ja mislim da je Derek čovek koji ima 85 godina, koji je ovako lepo izgleda i lepo se drži, i ja želim da ga pozdravimo i da mu se zahvalim što je došao u Novi Sad ponovo i dajem reč Violeti.
Hvala najviše. Poštovana publiko, dobrodošli. I najprej se izvinjavam zbog malo kašnjenja, bilo je veliko zaista medijsko interesovanje za razgovor sa našim večerašnjim gostom. Hvala vama što ste došli, što ste izdvojili vreme u, verujem, jedinstvenoj prilici da čujemo ovakvog umetnika. Evo po drugi put kod nas u Svilari. Ću sada reći samo kratko gde se sve nalaze njegova dela, u kojim muzejima, galerijama i kolekcijama. Dakle, Tate galerija, britanski muzej, muzej Viktorija Alberta u Londonu, zbirka njenog veličanstva kraljice u zamku Windsor, Nacionalna galerija Škotske u Edimburgu, Nacionalna galerija Poljske u Varšavi, Muzej umetnosti u Dallasu, kolekcija Manly u Houstonu, Muzej umetnosti u Izraelu, centar Wilfredo Lam u Havani, pa sve do Muzeja savremene umetnosti MoMA u Njujorku. I sada neko bi rekao reči dakle o veoma etabliranom umetniku koji je možda na neki način postao deo mainstreama, ali reč je takođe o umetniku koji je lični prijatelj Joe Stramera, koji radi ilustracije za The Clash. I sada, očigledno iz ovako poređenih informacija, s jedne strane Muzej Viktorija Alberta, s druge strane The Clash, dakle reč je o jednoj impozantnoj biografiji, o jednom dugom putu koji je prelažen u toku ovog života i karijere, i to je nešto o čemu ćemo razgovarati večeras. Za mene lično i za Svilaru, a mislim i za grad Novi Sad i za našu publiku, zaista je velika čast što imamo Dereka Bošira evo već nekoliko puta u Novom Sadu, i vašoj pažnji svakako preporučujemo izložbu koja se otvara kroz 2 dana. Mi ćemo ovaj razgovor voditi na engleskom jeziku, računajući da simultani prevod nije potreban. Ukoliko bude potrebna neka intervencija, zamolit ćemo naše kolegu da se uključi, ali znajući nekako publiku koju zanima stvaralaštvo Dereka Bošira, pretpostavljamo da to nije potrebno. Mr. Bošir, I wish you a warm welcome once again to the Svilara Cultural Station and to the Novi Sad. Let's start this conversation going back to the first days and foundation of the British pop art. We are privileged to hear from you as a first-hand witness of this process, how it was look like. A lot of well-known names are part of this puzzle. as David Hockney, Alan Jones, famous British director Ken Russell, and you know all of them personally. So can you tell us more about that?
Also, Pauline Botti, who tragically died at age 28 and is now being recognized. We must mention her. Well, you know, such a vast subject. How do you start? Well, there's a thing that I've been introducing in any interview I've had in the last few years, and that is the groundwork for pop art was laid in Britain in the 50s. You know, most people think of pop art as American. Well, of course it was, and it was very good, but it began in Britain, not America. And the foundation was laid by the painter and artist Richard Hamilton and various architects who came to public notice with an exhibition in London called This Is Tomorrow. And what it was basically was not pop art, it was popular culture, which was best defined by America in terms of popular culture. The other aspect that's interested in although those people laid the foundation, it was a group of us at the Royal College of Art who were students from 1959 to 62 who brought public art out to the public. I mean, there were many reasons that happened. One that probably is not touched on enough is at that time there was the beginning of regular, ordinary newspapers coming out with color supplements, magazines. And so, you know, it was a visual thing, so that was a good thing that also helped prompt. But there were so many things, radio, television. There was what is now thought of as a seminal television program went out in May '62, which in fact is by the great British filmmaker Ken Russell, and he did a film called Pop Goes the Easel. So there was this television program about the lives of four young, we were all still at college, by the way, and that was Peter Blake, Peter Phillips, Pauline Botti and myself, and it was like we were followed around for a day. It was a bit of a cheat, actually. It was 2 days filming, but actually it was about 10 days filming, but the thing. And the other important thing that I mentioned about that group of people, and there were others too, we were all working class. We were all blue collar. I don't know in Serbian what the phrase is, but we...
Just a second to explain to the audience.
Yeah.
Postoji ta fraza u sociologiji plavi okovratnici i beli okovratnici. Plavi okovratnici su simbol radničke klase i gospodin Bošir je upravo objasnio da su svi oni umetnici pop arta tog vremena zapravo bili pripadnici radničke klase koji su zapravo tada dobili i priliku po prvi put u britanskom sistemu školovanja da im visoko obrazovanje postane dostupno. Dakle, oni nisu bili beli okovratnici koji su visoki službenici, administrativni birokrati i tako dalje, već pripadnici radničke klase. Sorry for interrupting you, just one explanation for the audience.
Yeah, well, that leads me to something I'd like to say that's in connection with that. So, I said I was from the working class. My parents were live-in caretaker janitors. I don't know what that, perhaps you can explain later. My parents were caretaker janitors, and I left school at 16 to help them out financially. And the only person that said anything to me was the art master at school, at my grammar school. I was 16. And he said, very bad idea, Bošir, to leave school at 16. You've never passed any exam. But what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to become a butcher. And he said, what? I said, well, my best friend, Don, didn't get into grammar school, but I did, and he's still my friend, and his father runs a butcher shop, and so when he heard I was leaving, he offered me a job. So the art master said, had you ever thought of doing art? And I said, what's art? And he says, what you do on Thursday afternoons. And I said, oh, that's rather good. I like that. Although I was not very good at school, my favourite subjects were history and geography. So basically he said, well, he did a marvellous thing. He sat me down and he said, okay, this is art. You see that boy over there wearing that terrible sweater? He said, someone designed that. He said, cars are designed. People make textiles. Look at this magazine. This is graphic art. Someone designed this cover. Someone did these advertising. There's fashion design, there's textile design, of course there's painting, sculpture, photography. And he was just amazing, just laid it out for me, really. And he made a portfolio for me, so I got into the local art college. And I was lucky there because my local art college never ever refused anyone. There's no one that ever applied that didn't get in. And that was so they could all keep their jobs. And it was an incredibly small one. I mean, you know, art departments now have hundreds and hundreds of students. There was only 12 full-time students. So
there is a kind of generic connection between the opportunity for the education to the working class in Britain at the time and later development of pop art and actually the whole movement in the art of that period, if I understand you and follow you correctly.
Well, of course, you know, if you go back a few centuries, it was only men that were artists and they were gentlemen. You know, working class people never were artists. I mean, they became so with the French Impressionists, like, you know, was it Monet? His father was a baker, but, you know, there's that whole history. And even in Victorian times, when women went to art college, they could do everyone else. They could draw female nudes, but they weren't allowed to draw male nudes. God forbid. So, there are various changes, and also the work that was done before. I mean, there were great movements before, like Surrealism and Dada and things like that. But, you know, here we were, these young working class kids coming to this big city, London, and getting involved in things, you know. We were interested in, I mean, people were painting landscapes and portraits. That's what we did for 4 years before we went to the Royal College. And so we didn't want to do that. We were interested in boys, girls, sex, films, you know, and we became interested in popular culture, and popular culture became the thing that we all focused on. And for me, that's all I've ever done, made my art about popular culture.
I would say that kind of multi-layer or multifaceted character of pop art artists at the time, you were always connected as visual artist with other artistic fields like music, cinematography, popular culture of that period. It's not just characteristic, maybe we can say essential for the pop art, and a lot of, let's say, strong relations and friendships between different artists developed through the time, like your friendship with Joe Strummer and David Bowie. It's a kind of myth, but it's also a fact in your case. Can you tell us more about that intersection between different artistic fields?
Yeah, well, of course, what it was the rise of the working class. Oh God, I can't remember his name. John Osborne had written a play called, oh, I can't remember the name. Anyway, it was about the relationship between a working class man and a society woman. The Jewish writer Arnold Westler had written a play called The Kitchen, which was actually about, not about smart restaurants. It was all about what happens to people at the back who are the cooks and the chefs. So there was a ground laid by that. And the other thing is what you touched on is not only did the rise of the working class come via art, but it came via pop music. I mean, John Lennon and the Beatles went to Liverpool Art School. 3 of the pop groups called the Animals, they were at art college. The Who were, a lot of the famous names from the 60s all came, and they all went to art school because that was the only place in the early 50s and early 60s and late 50s where working class kids could get a further education. I mean, there were working class kids who went to Oxford and Cambridge universities, but they were exceptions. They were brilliant, semi-genius. But for the ordinary working class boy, kid, woman, art schools were the one place where you could basically get to university.
For example, your illustration for the albums of David Bowie and Clash was not just like a visual illustration, but the kind of essential intersection between music and visual art.
Yeah. Just to touch on a point to do with that, there's a man called James Cahill, who's British, and he came out to interview me and spend time doing research in Los Angeles. And, is it James Cahill or someone else? Anyway, doesn't matter the name. What he's doing, this person, is writing a book about the connection between the visual arts and music in the 60s. There's an interesting story that is not much talked about. So I don't know if anyone knows remembers a group from the 60s called the Animals, they were called. And they were all, 3 of them were from Newcastle Art College in the north of England. And they were taught by the British pop artist Richard Hamilton. And they left art school, went on to have these big music careers, and and they became famous as the Animals. And probably 10 years later, one of the Animals, the guy called Chaz, who was the bass player for the Animals, rang up Richard Hamilton and said, Richard, we've become so famous, he said, and I've made so much money, he said, but I'm so interested in art. So is there any way I could come and work for you for a month? I'll be your assistant. He said, I don't want to get paid. Now, the great thing about that is, for those people who know, but Richard Hamilton, as the artist, recreated Marcel Duchamp's glass piece, the famous Duchamp piece, and Richard Hamilton recreated. And who was his assistant? The bass player of the Animals, Chaz. So that piece, which is a seminal piece, was co-made or helped by Chaz.
I would like to ask Mr. Matarazzo about the reception of the audience in the Paris, for example, because we have here now one of the most important representatives of the British pop art, but I think it's very narrow and not the adequate to define the creation of Derekom Bošir. But can you tell us something more about the reception of the Parisian audience? In Paris, it's, let's say, important point for every artist in his career.
Okay. We have to talk about pop art in general, because I started with Derek in 1990, and at the time, Andy Warhol was not the star that he is today. At the time, pop art was not so popular. To give you an idea, it's stupid to talk about money, but it has to be. Probably you could buy a serigraph by Warhol at the time for €1,000. And I checked a week ago how much it costs today. It's €250,000. It's kind of stupid. But just to tell that Warhol is extremely known, but if you mention the other big names from the time, like Rosenquist or Wesselmann, all of these people who are big names and they cost millions of dollars today, at the time, we were not talking about them. I did this. Okay, so the American pop, which was supposed to be the most well-known, was not so well-known. So if you talk about it in English, it was worse. So when I started to say, well, I care about the English people, the English artists from this time, it was difficult for me because I'm a 73 years old man, and what I want to say, my collectors were my generation. So in order to push them into the pop art, I had to tell them, you remember the Stones, the Beatles, what was happening in the 60s? That was the key to attract them, because they were absolutely unknown in France. Even the big Hamilton, which is one of the founder of the pop art, was absolutely unknown in Paris in the 1990s. It came much later. And it's true for Paris, it's true for everywhere. I remember we went to Bilbao. Do you remember the date, Derek? What date was that?
Yeah, I forgot, but
15 years ago, probably.
Yeah.
Okay, at the time it was the first big show about the English artists. Nobody knew about them before. It's when you like something, you believe in something, you believe it's strong, you work every day, you start to be better day after day, and to convince people, and with the time I convinced a lot of people, and it was my pleasure. Plus, it's my youth, so it means a lot to me when he talks about the animals, for example. Most of the people you don't know about them. For me, I was 14 years old or 15, and it was really talking to me. This is it. Okay, so I think this is the answer.
Thank you. With the permission of okay.
Just to add to that, there were some very, very good French pop artists who were doing work very early on. I'm thinking of Rancillac and Ero particularly, but a lot of other people. So, what Alan said about discovery or not, it's a matter of public reception of it, of bringing art movements to the public is quite important.
With the permission of Mr. Bošir, I would like to show you, to show to the audience one interesting postcard made by Mr. Bošir recently, and it's a good. You can take it. It's a good introduction to my next question, which is related to engaged art. You were always obviously engaged as an artist. Can you tell us something more about recent artistic practice from that point of view? What do you think about contemporary?
Well, this postcard is about Donald Trump, and there's a picture. There's Donald Trump standing there, and there's a bird on his head, and he's wearing a skirt and high heels, and several other things, and he's saying, "There is no bird on my head. I am not wearing a skirt and high heels," and it's Donald Trump lies, basically. So yes, okay, in an interview more recently, within the last 10 years maybe, someone has said, what? You know, there's a terrible question like people asking what's your favorite film or something, or what's your favorite painting? But they said, what is your biggest influences? And I said, and I thought about it before, and I said there are two things that are strongest than any other thing as my influence. And one is coming from a working class background, and the other is Samuel Beckett. Samuel Beckett changed my life. When I came across Samuel Beckett, I find in Samuel Beckett, like I see in Shakespeare and Charles Dickens, how does any other person know so much about the human race? How can one person understand what humanity is? And I put Beckett in there. Oh, by the way, funny, it just shocked me, and maybe it's not the question, but as long as I can remember it, just going back to David Bowie, well, it's part of what we've been talking about. Going back to David Bowie, I knew him quite well, so I talked to him we talked about so many things that we had in common or but there was one thing that I saw fairly recently, and I've never understood why it's not more common knowledge. So this is it. When David was at high school, a teenager, he had a very bad relationship with his parents and very bad relationship with his school, because David is left-handed and they forced him to write right-handed, and he got into a lot of trouble at school. But he said what changed his life was reading Jack Kerouac's On the Road, and he said it totally changed his life. And he said as soon as he read it, he went out and bought a guitar and started painting. I mean, that's pretty incredible, I think. Yeah.
You already actually answered to my final question for this first part of this evening. You said that art has changed your personal life. My final question is maybe a little bit banal, but on the other hand, such important, especially today. Can art change the world? What do you think after all your life experience and professional experience?
No, I find art is very limited in being able to change the world, even though I said it in that particular work I made. I think, although I think what artists are working on more currently is more influential than it's been in the history of art. We have to go back to Renaissance art when, just to make a living, a lot of Renaissance artists had to make religious art, and they weren't religious. And then what changed in sponsorship of artists was merchants, and not religious people who were in business, who had the finances to actually support artists. So that's things that have changed. I was going to tell you a story related to that. The art world is so diverse, and I had to quite recently, by the way, you will find on television some very, very good websites talking about art. There's one American man who is a professor at Yale University, and every week he puts up a list of every scholarship or grant that artists could apply for with a deadline. And he's recently put up on his site advice about how to get a Guggenheim Fellowship. I don't even know, but I actually was lucky enough to receive a Guggenheim Fellowship. And he's done a lot of research, and he tells you, but there's a lot of news. It's like, it's not quite like this, but journalism and newspapers and magazines carry sport, obviously, but in relation to that, art is getting much more publicity than ever before, and there are these very, very good sites that give you updates, tell you the trouble of museums, people striking, but also about particular artworks that could be seen. I mean, think of the difference. Okay, so people here know that I'm very friendly with David Hockney, but what about David? The last painting that David sold was for 92 million. 92 million. And that's why David, I think one of the reasons that David Hockney now lives in Normandy in France is just, he's had enough of it. I mean, you can imagine it. If you have 2 museums every year, 2 museum shows every month for 20 years. David, I could retell a story that I'll retell, perhaps to end, I'll retell a David story, or 2. I'll leave you with 2 David stories, because they are the art world. I mean, that's what happens to a person that's right at the top. So, first story is one of the hugest fans of David Hockney is the King of Belgium. So the King of Belgium not only is a great fan, but he's a big collector of David's work. He's got quite a collection of David's work over the years. He's also almost, as was described to me, a sycophant, which means, when he meets David, he's got his mouth open. I mean, it's, extraordinary. So, very nice, I'm told, a very nice person, the king, by the person who told me. And to such an extent that the king had arranged to go and see David Hockney in Normandy, in France, more recently. And one of the reasons he went, and he told David, although David already knew, that they'd asked the King of Belgium to open David's exhibition in Palais des Arts. I think it was in Palais des Arts. So they asked David, so the King of Belgium went to see David in France and said, they've asked me to open your show. He said, I'm so honored, he said, and he said, you will be there, you will be going to the opening. And David said, oh yeah, of course, knowing that he wouldn't, he wouldn't go. I mean, there's only people like David that turn down going to shows at the Guggenheim and their own openings. So, as I said to someone, I'd go to a coffee bar if they were having a show of my work. So there are differences in the art world. So, so come the opening in Brussels of David's show, it's packed. Paparazzi, TV, you know, there's just so many media there waiting to film the great event with the King of Belgium and the King of Art, or the Queen of Art, you know, meeting. So the King arrives, and the person that's telling the story, who was a curator of the Tate, a friend of mine, said the King arrived and came in and he said, "Where's David? Where's David?" And of course David wasn't there. And the point about that, she hadn't been told that David said he'd be there. She knew he wouldn't be there, but David hadn't told him that he would be there. Why wouldn't he be there? Because he had an opening in lingerie in Paris at the same evening, you know, so he had 2 museum shows. Sometimes David had 3 museum shows opening in the same day. So my friend said, I've never seen a reaction. It was like a balloon being deflated. The King of Belgium went, he practically collapsed that David wasn't there.
You just remind me of a famous sentence of one also famous British artist, contemporary Banksy. He said, "Copyright is for losers," regarding what you said about 92 millions of Hockney's last piece of art. So
it wouldn't affect David at all.
Yeah,
that he did that. I mean, if I'd have said to him, David, 92 million. Yes, that's the art world, he would say. Nothing to do with me. And that's the first colour. And it's our house in Los Angeles. And I put that up just because I love to do a book. And I know there's been so many on artist studios. When I go to artist studios, I love to see what they've got on the wall. It's very interesting, artist studios. And unfortunately, I don't have an artist studio, but this is my house. The picture up there is me in a blue sweater. Can you see that? That's David. That's a reproduction of David Hockney's portrait of me that he painted. The painting with the blue background is the only painting now that I own from 1962. The only painting I have drawings from that period, but that's the only one I've kept. I also had a huge mask collection, you can see top left. I also have, and you can't see it very well, but with the Hockney portrait, if you come down to that glass cabinet, I have a very, very large toy collection. Also on the left, there's a London double-decker bus, and that was given to me because the bus company had asked 6 artists to design something to go along the bus. They actually never did it, but the guy who arranged it, when he said, "Oh, I got this bus, do you want it?" And I said, "Sure." As I knew David Bowie so well, I've done a lot of, over the years, I've done a lot of work about him. God, and I can't remember.
Can you explain this a little bit?
Explain this. Well, I was worried you'd ask me that because I really can't remember the name of the woman. That's a woman on the right from the 18th century. What's her name?
There is Cornelis.
Corneli. She was the David Bowie of the time, in the 18th century, and she set fashion and music, and she was, before influencers were a professor, she was. So I found her, and I just came across her. I was looking at a book in a second-hand bookshop, and I picked it up, and I saw this photograph, and then I saw it was a woman, and then I saw what's going on here, and then I read about her, and I thought that's good. My work comes from any source. It could be, I can overhear a conversation with two people talking, and I think, oh, that's interesting. I think I'll do a painting of that. So my source material, I come from anywhere. Next. Oh, sorry, let me go back to that one. That's a famous David Bowie costume, which was made specifically for his concert in Tokyo. Next, so over the years, I've done various portraits of David. Perhaps a note about something there. David Bowie is known for that flash across his face. Interesting story about that. Pretty amazing. So David was getting ready for a photo shoot, and his makeup artist came in and said, David, look at this flash sign. I think you better put that on your body. And Duffy, the photographer, said, no, better go on your face. And so that's how it came about. But what is that flash? Actually, that flash is what Elvis Presley had on the side of his airplane. His private airplane had that flash on. Here's coincidence number 2. Elvis Presley and David Bowie share the same birthday date. Yes. Next. Okay. So I have whatever work I've done over the years, be it installation, I have never done performance art. Well, I have actually, and painting, sculpture, film, videos. I've always kept doing drawing. I've never let up on drawing. Unfortunately, I can't tell you this, but I can tell you what it's in general about. I did a series of drawings, and I'm actually going to do one about Novim Sadom, because I've asked Nabo to get me some local newspapers. So what I do in this series, which was way back in that one is 2010, is I take a magazine or newspaper and survey it and editorialize and take images. This, I think, is a magazine from a rock and roll magazine shop, I think. Next, I tell my students, the trouble, I often had to tell them, trouble with you, you're so precious about what you make your art from. You could make your art from anything. In fact, I find that the most obscure and difficult, I think, an artwork is going to be, it's usually most successful because it's inventive. You have to be inventive to solve the problem, really. This is a painting from a series of paintings I did when I took sort of classical National Geographic photographs and put people with cell phones in front of them taking photographs. And of course, they're all in the setting of a beautiful landscape, but they're watching sports, sex, everything on on their iPhones, nothing to do with what they're looking at. So I did about 10 paintings, had an exhibition. This is a national park in Texas. Next. I've also, over the years, I mean, there's certain things that I stick to, like I've always made work about popular culture, but I've always been interested in opposites, the idea of, and I've done work about gender in opposites, I've done work about architecture and opposites, I've done work, and this is fairly typical of taking two icons that I've always loved, Alice in Wonderland, the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland on the right. And I spent 1 year in India. This is on the left, is Kali, the goddess Kali. And when I left the Royal College, I went and spent 1 year in Calcutta in India. And so those images that are precious to me. And then basically the background was another aspect that I contain in my work is randomness. I mean, the idea of the inclusion of Alice in Wonderland's rabbit and the goddess, Hindu goddess, is very purposeful. And the things in the background, I just pick up a magazine and a book and just put things, oh, that's interesting, I'll do that. And I do purposely random things. Next. Oh, this is one of my earliest paintings from, I think, even 1961. It might be 1962. But one aspect we haven't talked about is that pop art is about popular culture. And in my engagement with popular culture, I never ever painted a pin-up. I mean, people say to me, oh, you're a pop artist. What pin-ups did you do? And I said, I've never done a pin-up. I mean, later I've done transsexuals, I've done stuff in the last 10 years, but I've never done, I mean, because my work wasn't about that. My work was my work with people who really seriously study it was a critique of American culture. In fact, it was a critique of how American culture was taking over British culture. So this is a famous, England's glory is a famous matchbox. Red matches.
I would like to tell something about this first. For me, it's a very important piece because it means that the English Empire is decreasing, and you see the American flag coming. You know, so it means that he understood very long ago that the world is changing, and if we can talk about these days when you see all of these big blocks, China, USSR, United States, the movement, new empires, they are new empires and they are all one finishing. So it means to me that this is the end of the British Empire. About that I would like it to tell a story that I love, because he is very involved in politics. He did something in Prague, I think in '68, and I would like you to tell this story.
Okay. In 1968, I was sent with the other British pop artist, Joe Tilson, to do a cultural exchange and to meet Czechoslovakian artists. And so we went there. I think we were in Prague for about a week and a half, and then we went to Hungary. And Hungary was at that time still under the Russian rule, but Prague wasn't. It was setting free, and You go to bars and there was cabaret on, it was just amazing. The population, what was going on. So we decided, well, since we were there for maybe a week and a half, we'd do an art piece. And so we did a project called Smith Novak Event. So, the most common name in the London British telephone directory, which now don't exist anymore, was Smith. I think if you look at the London telephone directory, there are 3 to 4 pages just of Smiths and their telephone number and address, by the way. We found out that in Prague, the similar thing was Novak, Mr. and Mrs. Novak, several pages. So we went to the British Embassy in Prague and said, well, could we Xerox all the Smith pages? And we did the same in Prague with the Novaks. And so them decided to do a project, and we made announcements in the next few days saying, please, everyone that's interested in an art project, please gather at this particular square in Prague, because we're going to do the Smith Novak event. And what it was, we bought hundreds, if not thousands, of plain postcards. And on the back, we wrote, since you cannot wave or smile to Mr. and Mrs. Smith of 14 Denby Close, London, southwest border, we invite you to send a postcard from Prague to a Smith. And we did the same, and please send me a card back. So we had this exchange between Smiths and Novaks, and there were apparently quite a lot happened. I've had exhibitions of that work. Does that explain it? Do I need to say more?
It seemed that you were very political. You wanted to create a connection between the East and West and the world.
Yeah, I mean,
because we're talking about freedom.
Well, someone mentioned earlier, I did something called Architecture Changed the World Overnight. I did a series of postcards. But, I'm not sure it could. I mean, I think you do your best, and you can do what little you can do politically. And also, I've always believed in, one of my favorite political artists is Dutch, but he lives in New York, and he said a great thing that I always believe in, and I apply it to my work. He said, make your art political, but not political art. Avoid that. We all know that. You're going to reach the public if you're a little more subtle than that. Oh, David Bowie and my children when they're young, they're now in their young 30s, so this is David and I, we went back to live in England thinking that that's where I spent the rest of my life. We moved back to America. I don't know if you know, but one of the most famous, and I think, well, he's not neglected, but he should be much bigger. He's huge in England. There's an artist called Stanley Spencer, British artist who worked in the 20s, 30s, 40s, Stanley Spencer. And I tell people that I think myself and David Hockney and other people got into the Royal College at that time because we were painting Stanley Spencer paintings. But very near where this photograph was taken, there's a marvelous chapel that Stanley Spencer was commissioned to decorate. Oh, it was no longer, well, it was a chapel. But he decorated the walls and the ceilings. And I told David about it, and he's a great Stanley Spencer fan. So he said, shall we go? So I took him to the Stanley Spencer. I've taken David to other shows. I was in Paris exhibiting Alain, and there was a great show right opposite Alain's gallery, which is right by the Pompidou Center in Paris. And there was a beautiful show called Matisse in Nice. And Alain took me to a cafe that he used to go to next door to the gallery, and he introduced me to other dealers. And one art dealer there who had a gallery said, "Oh, how are you? Are you being a tourist you being an English tourist in Paris?" I said, "No, I don't do that. I've done all that stuff 50 years ago." But so I just hang about the streets and I walk. I walk for like an hour and a half or 2 hours, then go for a coffee, and then I walk for another 2 hours and have lunch. So that's my modus operandi. And he said, "Oh, is there anything you haven't done?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'd like to see the show at the Pompidou opposite, but I'd have to go at 8 o'clock in the morning to get in line. I mean, it's so packed." So this dealer says, Andre, come up." He said, Andre's the curator at the Pompidou. He said, "This is English artist, you can't get into this Matisse show. Can you get him in?" And I said, "Sure." He said, "Sure, come on Thursday." We know we're to 12 on Thursday. So I said, "Oh, now I got to tell one little story." So Alain is there and said, "Can I go?" And then I said, "Actually, there's 2 other people who really want to go." He said, 1, 2, 3, 4. And he said, "Who is it?" And I said, "David Bowie." He said, "He can come." So I took David Bowie around the Matisse show.
What you should know is the fact that the big boss of the museum didn't care about the people who was there, and he didn't do anything. So we saw that in the morning when the museum was closed, and many years after, the boss of the museum recognized they made a big mistake. Nobody of the boss they wanted to come and to say hello to him. Yeah, you remember that?
Yeah, I had to defend David. Some woman rang up and I said, "Can I have my autograph?" And David said, "No." And David said to me, "Look, that may have looked very harsh, but if I'd have signed that autograph, some other person would come up and rip my shirt off." So, at the Pompidou, although it didn't open until 12 o'clock, there were parties of school children everywhere, and each teacher in his gallery was talking about Matisse's, but all the students were like they were watching a tennis match, and they watched David Bowie go past. Next. Oh, not only did I do a designer cover called Lodger, but in his next album, I think it's called Stereo, he's got my painting projected on him, and it's projected on the background. Next. So I work with the Clash. I better tell you a little bit about the Clash. Joe Strummer, the leader of the Clash, the singer, the punk singer, was actually not called Joe Strummer. Joe Strummer of the Clash was actually, when he was in my class, I taught Joe in his first year at art college. He was 18 or 17, I think, and he sat in my class, bearing in mind he's the great punk, who said, hey man, I want everyone to call me Woody. I want to be called Woody. Don't call me Jim, whatever it was. Call me Woody. And of course, that was because of the great American socially orientated folk singer, Woody Guthrie. And Woody Guthrie, was a huge hero to him, and as was Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan always talked about the influence of Woody Guthrie on him. And so he used to, Joe Woody used to sit in the corner of my class with a wooden guitar, singing Blowing in the Wind. Fast forward 6 years, and I'm walking down Oxford Street at night, and who's walking towards me but Woody, plus his band, plus screaming fans. And I go up to him and I say, Woody. And he said, I'm not called Woody now. I said, I know, Joe, I'm a great fan of The Clash, and I know all your songs. Within a week, I got a call from another ex-student called Caroline Kuhn, and she said, I hear you were talking to Joe. I said, yeah. Well, he said, Joe's just called me and said, would I ask Derekom Boširom if he designed the Clash second songbook? Now, we have to put this in perspective. This was 1979, and the Clash didn't come in, MTV didn't come into existence to 1981, so this was 2 years before MTV. So what pop groups did at that time is they made songbooks, hundreds of pictures of the groups, plus a few chords and maybe the lyrics. So I said to Caroline, oh, fine. I said, I'm not a graphic designer, but I've done some graphic design, but what's my brief? Because I know lots of graphic designers and they say, oh, I've got this brief. They want this, so some type, they want me to put in this and this, and I can't include that. And on the left-hand page, and I think, I said, so what's my brief? Joe said, tell Derek that there's 48 pages. We'll send him all the lyrics and tell him to do what the fuck he likes. That was his thing to me, because it was the opposite to what graphic designers normally get, tight briefs. So I was like, actually I had that with David Bowie too a bit. Next. That's an album cover that wasn't used. But let me tell you something about that. So we didn't drop David from the second story of anywhere. So that photograph, we made a special table in that shape. So this David is on a table that's, you can't see it, of course. He's got his legs out, and we made the table so he's lying on the table, and we shot him from above, and we put the bathroom sink there and the mirror. In fact, in the final one, there's no mirror. But David, yeah. And if you look at the LP, David's nose is like this. And someone said, oh, you put a bit of glass on his nose. Yeah, we said, no, we had someone off camera. We had a fishing line on David's nose, and someone pulled it every time, just before we photographed it. Next. Oh, is that it? No more? Okay. Thanks, Tim. If there's any questions after that, you're welcome to ask. I just...
say something, if you want.
You can. Oh, please, please.
I will talk like an art dealer. The job of an art dealer is to promote artists, but how can you choose the good one? And you know, with the years, because I mean, I did this job for almost 50 years, you always have to choose somebody creative, and creation is the word. And most of the time, because you think you can sell well, you promote somebody, and the interest is very in the short term. It doesn't go further. And why? You know, I started with Derek in '91, I think. It's more than 30 years. And when I saw those pictures, I'm still astonished to look at them, because he's a creator. What you've probably seen this evening, you never saw before. It means he creates something different. And this is the basis for an art dealer to promote art. You have to choose the right one, the one who doesn't care about to be successful or not successful. They care about doing what they have in them. This is what I wanted to tell.
I'll just end with a story, because we did touch on the Beatles. So I'll tell you 2 Beatles stories. I knew the Beatles, and mainly John Lennon, because I had a friend called Bob Freeman who designed the first 4 Beatles albums. He took photographs of the first 4 Beatles albums. And he knew John because John, when he was married to his first wife, Cynthia, lived in the apartment above my friend Bob. And because John then went to Liverpool Art School, he said to my friend Bob, I know you've got some artist friends, so anytime they come around, let me know, and if I'm not touring, I'd like to meet them. So that's how I met John. And I met him just in that social thing, just 3 times, just him and I. And I thought you'd like to know that one time I said to him, John, what's your favorite artist? And he hardly blinked and said, Hieronymus Bosch. That was what you'd think it too might be. The other Beatles story is, I was seeing the Beatles, they were backstage before they were going to go on in some concert in North London. And I went into this very cramped room that they were in. And I sat down, and we all sat down, and an equally famous singer called Cilla Black came in to the room because she was, you know, fronting the Beatles. And she looked around, and she's from Liverpool, and she said, there's no seat. And she looked at me and she said, I'll sit on your lap. So she sat on my lap. And I told my father this story, and my father said, I'd have given 2 years of my life for that to happen, because he was a huge Cilla Black fan. So I think that's all.
Thank you. I think we were all privileged this evening. It was a kind of real masterclass. We heard a lot of behind the scene anecdotes, information, but also a kind of explanation and maybe demystification of the artistic process. So we are all grateful to you, and nadam se da se vidimo na otvaranju izložbe. Hvala vam na vremenu koje ste izdvojili za ovo zaista posebno veče.